He had sworn they weren't his children, but 3 years later, he found himself staring into his own eyes, reflected in theirs. Andrew Mitchell had built his empire on precision and control, never allowing emotions to cloud his judgment. As CEO of one of the nation's largest construction corporations, he was accustomed to negotiating multi-million-dollar deals without the slightest flicker of doubt. Yet on that night, 3 years ago, standing in the soft glow of his penthouse living room, his certainty had been sharper and colder than ever before. Emma stood in front of him, her hands trembling, lips pale, eyes glistening with unshed tears. She had always been beautiful in a way, untouched by the chaos of the world, her blonde hair spilling over her shoulders, those deep brown eyes searching his face for something. Perhaps hope, perhaps understanding, but all Andrew could feel was suspicion and a rising, choking anger. She told him she was pregnant. The words hung in the air between them like fragile glass about to shatter. His mind, quick and ruthless, began turning over every possibility. She wanted something. She had to. Why now? Why her? The trust that had once bound them had been fraying for weeks, worn thin by whispers and the small cracks he thought he saw in her stories. The conclusion came to him with the same cold logic that had built his career. The child couldn't be his. He stepped closer, but not to comfort her. His voice, usually steady and controlled, was laced with steel. Leave, those aren't my children. The way she flinched at the words almost made him pause, but the wall inside him was already built. He wouldn't let her in, wouldn't let the possibility of betrayal take root in his life. Her tears broke free then, running down her cheeks. But she didn't plead, she didn't scream. She simply looked at him, her expression shifting from heartbreak to something far harder. A silent verdict passed between them. She turned and walked out, her footsteps echoing against the polished floor. The click of the door closing behind her sounded like the end of a chapter neither of them would admit was still being written. That night, Andrew poured himself a drink and stood by the window overlooking the glittering city. He told himself, it was the right decision, the only decision. He was a man who cut out problems before they grew roots, who knew when something no longer served him. But as the hours stretched into dawn, and the silence of the apartment pressed in on him, he realized something unsettling. He couldn't stop replaying the look in her eyes as she left. It wasn't just pain he'd seen, it was finality, and perhaps, something that looked uncomfortably like truth. He tried to drown the thought in whiskey and work, telling himself that love, like any other risk, could destroy you if you weren't careful. And Andrew Mitchell had sworn never to be destroyed by anyone. Emma left the city the very next morning. Long before the sun rose high enough to spill light over the skyline she had once thought of as hers. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, not even the few friends she still trusted. The train ride to the coast felt endless. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks, giving her too much space to think about the life she had just left behind. On in her bag, tucked between a sweater and a small notebook, was the ultrasound photo she had planned to show Andrew. Now it was just another piece of paper, creased at the edges, holding a memory of hope that felt foolish in hindsight. She arrived in a small coastal town that smelled of salt water and rain. A place where no one cared who she had been or what she had lost. The streets were quiet, lined with old brick shops and pastel-painted houses. There, in a weathered home, left to her by an aunt she barely knew, Emma began the slow work of building a new life. When her daughters were born, two tiny girls with identical cascades of chestnut hair and eyes so dark they looked like melted chocolate, Emma's breath caught in her chest. They were living proof of everything Andrew had refused to believe. Every time she looked at them, she saw pieces of him, and the ache of that recognition never fully faded. Life as a single mother was not the kind of hardship that could be romanticized. Emma worked mornings in a small cafe by the pier, carrying trays of coffee and baskets of pastries to tourists who spoke of their weekend getaways and dinner reservations, unaware of the exhaustion hidden behind her polite smile. Afternoons were for her daughters, walks to the park, stories before naps, endless laundry that somehow piled up faster than she could fold it. Evenings were often spent at the local shelter, where she helped with everything from sorting donations to organizing small fundraisers. It wasn't glamorous, but it grounded her, kept her from feeling like she was drifting too far from herself. The town slowly embraced her, not because of who she had been, but because of who she was now, a mother who worked hard, a woman who didn't crumble under the weight she carried. Yet, no matter how full her days became, there were nights when the quiet pressed in too heavily, when she would sit by the window with a mug of tea gone cold, watching the sea breathe under the moonlight. In those moments, she allowed herself To remember Andrew, not the man who had pushed her away, but the one she had once believed in. She would see him in the curve of her daughter's smiles, in the determined set of their little jaws, in the way they tilted their heads when curious, and though she never spoke his name aloud, she knew the truth that time could never erase. He was part of them, whether he wanted to be or not. In the 3 years that followed, Andrew Mitchell's life expanded in every measurable way except the one that mattered. His company broke records for annual profit, securing high-profile government contracts and branching into international markets. His name was regularly printed in glossy magazines alongside words like visionary and tycoon. The penthouse he had once briefly shared with Emma was renovated into something out of an architectural showcase, marble floors that reflected the city skyline, glass walls that made him feel as if he were floating above the world. He hosted fundraisers, negotiated deals in penthouse boardrooms, and traveled to resorts where the air was thick with exclusivity and the scent of imported cigars. From the outside, his life looked untouchable. Yet, behind the immaculate facade, Andrew carried an unease he couldn't quite name. It wasn't loneliness, not in the conventional sense. There were always people around him, always women willing to be photographed on his arm, always colleagues ready to laugh at his jokes over drinks that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But the connection was surface deep, and no amount of attention seemed to fill the hollow space that had taken root inside him. There were nights when the city lights glittered like 1,000 unkept promises, and in the quiet between meetings or the stillness before sleep, his mind wandered back to Emma. At first, he dismissed it as nostalgia, the kind that creeps in when you've had one too many drinks or are worn thin by work. But the memories didn't fade with time. If anything, they grew sharper, anchored by details he couldn't stop replaying. The way her laughter used to catch him off guard, the stubborn tilt of her chin when she challenged him, the softness in her voice on nights when they spoke about the future. And then there was the last time he saw her, the tear-bright eyes that had held both pain and something unshakably certain, as if she knew a truth he had refused to face. The image of her pregnant had haunted him in ways he refused to admit, gnawing at the edges of his confidence. He told himself he had been right to push her away, that a man in his position couldn't afford the kind of vulnerability she represented. Still, there were moments, rare but piercing, when he wondered if he had condemned himself to a life of victories that would never taste like enough. His personal life became a carefully curated rotation. He dated models, lawyers, socialites, women who understood the transactional nature of being close to someone like him. None of them lasted more than a few months, and he preferred it that way. The relationships ended without drama, replaced as easily as a season's wardrobe. Yet, with each passing year, it became harder to ignore the sense that he was running from something, even if he couldn't, or wouldn't. Name it. Business trips kept him moving, each new city another stage on which to perform the role he had perfected. The driven, charming, untouchable CEO. But airports and luxury hotels had a way of blurring into one another. And in the moments when the applause quieted, the silence felt heavier than it once had. He didn't think of himself as a man who had regrets. Regret was a weakness, and weakness had no place in the world he inhabited. But every so often, in the middle of an ordinary day, a thought would break through like an uninvited guest. Somewhere, Emma was living a life without him, and he didn't know if that made him relieved, or if it terrified him. One rainy evening, after a deal-closing dinner that left him strangely restless, Andrew stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching the water streak down the glass. The city stretched out below him, vibrant and alive. But all he could think about was a quiet coastal town he hadn't seen in years. He imagined streets lined with small shops, the sound of waves in the distance, and the ghost of a woman with blonde hair walking away from him, her figure fading into a horizon he had chosen not to follow. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself she didn't matter. But the truth settled into him like the rain outside, steady, unrelenting, impossible to ignore. It was late autumn when Andrew's carefully ordered life collided with the past he had tried to keep buried. His company had been invited to sponsor a prestigious charity gala on the coast, an event that promised the right kind of publicity and access to influential donors. He accepted without hesitation, seeing it as another opportunity to expand his reach. The location was a high-end restaurant, overlooking the harbor, the kind of place where crystal chandeliers spilled golden light over white linen tables, and the scent of fresh seafood mingled with the salt-tinged breeze from the open balcony doors. It was refined, expensive, and entirely within the world he understood. Yet, the moment he stepped inside, Something in the air felt different, heavier. Somehow, though he couldn't explain why. The evening began as most of his did: handshakes, polite laughter, conversations about contracts and future collaborations. Waiters glided between tables carrying silver trays of champagne flutes, and the low hum of conversation was punctuated by the occasional burst of applause as a new donation was announced. Andrew had positioned himself near the balcony, making the rounds with practiced charm, when his gaze drifted across the room and landed on a figure that stopped him cold. Emma. She was standing near one of the tall windows, her profile illuminated by the warm, amber glow of the lights above. Her hair was longer than he remembered, the soft blonde waves falling past her shoulders. And she wore a simple but elegant dress that seemed almost out of place among the sequins and jewels of the other women in the room. Yet, she outshone them all effortlessly. She was talking to another guest, smiling faintly, but it was what, or rather, who was beside her that made Andrew's breath catch. Two little girls, identical in every way. Small hands clutching the skirts of Emma's dress, chestnut hair shining under the lights, deep brown eyes that seemed almost too large for their faces. They looked around the room with a mixture of shyness and curiosity, whispering to each other before breaking into small giggles, and then, as if sensing his gaze, they both turned toward him. The impact was immediate and visceral. He saw himself in them, not in some vague, imagined way, but in the undeniable shape of their features, the arch of their brows, the tilt of their chins. His own eyes stared back at him from their small faces, and for a moment, the noise of the gala faded into a distant hum. His heart pounded in a way it hadn't in years. And a rush of conflicting emotions crashed over him: shock, disbelief, something dangerously close to hope. Emma noticed him. Then her smile vanished, replaced by a stillness that felt like a shield snapping into place. Her gaze locked on his, steady and unflinching, and for a few suspended seconds, it was as if no one else existed in the room. Andrew started toward her before he had even decided to move, weaving through the crowd until he was standing a few feet away. "Emma," he said, his voice lower than he intended, almost hesitant. She straightened, her chin lifting slightly, the old defiance in her posture instantly familiar. "Andrew." Her tone was cool, polite enough for the public setting. But the undercurrent was clear: this was not a welcome reunion. He glanced down at the girls, who were now watching him with wide, curious eyes. "Are they?" "No." The word was sharp. Final. She didn't give him time to finish, her voice, dropping to a near whisper, meant for him alone. "You don't get to ask. You made your choice 3 years ago." Her words hit harder than any deal gone wrong or public criticism he had ever faced. She turned slightly, placing a hand on each girl's shoulder, guiding them toward the exit, as if she could physically remove him from their world by walking away. He stood there watching them disappear into the crowd, his mind reeling with the truth his eyes had already accepted. For the rest of the evening, he went through the motions, shaking hands, making small talk, but he couldn't shake the image of those identical faces or the unspoken accusation in Emma's eyes. By the time he left the restaurant, the night air sharp against his skin, one thought had embedded itself deep in his mind, immovable and absolute. He had to know them. And this time, he wasn't going to let her walk away without a fight. The following days were a blur of distraction and restless energy for Andrew. He went into the office as usual, sat through meetings, signed contracts, and approved project proposals, but his focus was fractured. Every time he tried to concentrate, his mind replayed the moment the girls had turned toward him, their eyes locking with his in that uncanny, undeniable reflection. He could still see the guarded way Emma had looked at him, the sharp edge in her voice when she said no, as if she could cut through every question before it was even spoken. He had been told no countless times in his career, but never like that. This was not the rejection of a business proposal, this was a wall built from pain, betrayal, and years of living without him. He found out where Emma worked within a week, though it wasn't difficult. The coastal town was small, the kind of place where people noticed new faces and remembered old ones. She managed shifts at a small cafe near the pier, a place with hand-painted signs, whitewashed wooden chairs, and the scent of freshly baked bread drifting out into the street. Andrew's first attempt to walk in felt almost absurd. This was far from his world of private clubs and executive dining rooms. Yet, when the door chimed and he stepped inside, he realized it suited her. It was warm and inviting, the kind of place that made you forget the rush outside. Emma was behind the counter, her hair tied back in a loose knot, a faint flush on her cheeks from the work. She looked up when she heard his voice ordering coffee. And for a split second, there was something unguarded in her expression, surprise, maybe even a flicker of the woman he once knew. Before the shutters came down again, she served him with polite indifference. Her words clipped, but she didn't tell him to leave. That was enough to keep him coming back. Over the next few weeks, he became a regular. Sometimes he stopped in for coffee, sometimes for lunch, and, occasionally, he'd catch the girls at a corner table, coloring or reading while they waited for their mother to finish her shift. They were cautious around him at first, peeking at him over the edges of their books, whispering to each other in that private twin language. But slowly their reserve began to melt. One afternoon, when Emma had stepped into the back, one of the girls shyly offered him a crayon and pointed at her drawing. It was a messy but charming picture of a tall man holding hands with two smaller figures. He didn't need to ask who they were meant to be. Emma noticed the growing connection but made no comment. Her eyes followed every interaction, her expression unreadable, but she didn't interfere. Andrew took care not to push too hard. He asked about the girls, their school, favorite activities, but never about their father. He brought small gifts sometimes. Nothing extravagant, a book he thought they might like, a box of their favorite pastries from a bakery he'd found in the city. The girls began to greet him openly, their faces lighting up when he arrived, and each time, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, his presence in someone's life wasn't measured in terms of deals closed or influence gained. These moments were simple, almost fragile, and yet they carried a weight that unsettled him in the best possible way. He found himself lingering after his coffee was gone, watching the way the girls laughed together, the way Emma moved around the cafe with quiet efficiency, the way the late afternoon light caught in her hair. He began to see what he had missed all these years, not just in her, but in himself. Still, the unspoken truth hung between them. She hadn't forgiven him, and she hadn't admitted what he already knew in his bones. But for the first time since that night in his penthouse, Andrew felt something more powerful than regret. He felt determination. He had walked away once, convinced he was right. Now he intended to stay in, if it meant breaking down every wall she had built to keep him out. It was a Saturday afternoon when the unexpected happened, the kind of moment that shifts the ground beneath your feet. Without warning, the cafe was busy, the air filled with the sound of clinking cups, low conversations, and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine. Andrew had stopped in, as he often did now, planning to take the girls to the park after Emma's shift. They were sitting at their usual table near the window, coloring with serious concentration, when a sharp cry cut through the cozy hum of the room. One of the twins, Sophie, had slipped from her chair while reaching for a colored pencil on the floor. She landed awkwardly, the shock of it making her burst into tears. Before Emma could reach her, Andrew was already moving. He knelt beside Sophie, speaking softly, his voice low and steady. As he checked her arm and knee, she clung to him without hesitation, her sobs subsiding as he reassured her that everything was fine. He reached into his pocket for a clean handkerchief, dabbing at her tears before lifting her into his arms. Emma arrived a moment later, looking anxious, but stopped short when she saw the way Sophie had curled against him, her small fingers tangled in the fabric of his shirt, as if she trusted him completely. The moment felt heavier than it should have. Emma took a breath, watching as Andrew carried Sophie to the counter and sat her on one of the stools. Still murmuring gentle words that seemed to calm her instantly, he found the first aid kit behind the counter without being told where it was, cleaned the small scrape on her knee, and placed a band-aid over it with the kind of patience that didn't match the ruthless man she remembered from before. By the time he was done, Sophie was smiling again, proud of her brave bandage, and Andrew was smiling back at her as if she just handed him something far more valuable than a child's gratitude. Emma busied herself at the register, pretending not to watch, but her mind was already spinning. She had spent years convincing herself that he didn't care, that he had walked away because his pride mattered more than she ever could. Yet here he was, not just present, but engaged, knowing instinctively how to comfort a child he had only begun to know. It unsettled her in ways she didn't want to admit. The man who had once been so quick to judge, so unwilling to listen, was now sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the girls, letting them braid his tie into knots while they giggled. Later, when the cafe had emptied and the girls had run ahead to gather their things for the park, Emma found herself standing beside him. There was a pause, the kind that seemed to pull the air tight between them. "I hate what you did," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the counter instead of his face. "I hate that you left us, that you didn't even want to hear me out." She hesitated, her voice softer now. but I hate more that you're making me believe you again." Andrew didn't try to defend himself, didn't offer excuses or explanations. He only looked at her, his gaze steady and unflinching, and said, "I'm not leaving this time. No matter how long it takes, I'm not going anywhere." Something in the certainty of his tone lodged itself in her chest, uncomfortable yet undeniably real. She didn't respond, but when the girls came running back, both of them reaching for his hands, she didn't stop them. As they walked out into the crisp afternoon air, the three of them ahead of her, Emma realized that the walls she had built weren't as solid as she had thought, and that frightened her almost as much as it gave her hope. The change between them was subtle at first, so gradual that Emma could almost pretend it wasn't happening. Andrew continued coming to the cafe several times a week, sometimes with the intention of taking the girls out for a few hours, other times simply to be near them. He learned their routines, what books they liked to read before bed, which swings at the park they each claimed as their own, the way one of them liked her pancakes cut into tiny squares while the other insisted on syrup being poured in a spiral. The girls began to talk about him at home without hesitation, their stories full of laughter and excitement, and Emma found it harder and harder to remind herself why she had to keep her guard up. One Sunday afternoon, Andrew invited them to the small marina just beyond the pier. He had rented a modest sailboat for the day, not one of the gleaming luxury yachts she imagined he could easily access, but a simple vessel that felt approachable and warm. The girls squealed with delight as they climbed aboard, their tiny hands gripping the railing while the dock swayed beneath them. Andrew took time to show them the ropes, literally teaching them how to secure knots and explaining which lines controlled the sails. He didn't rush them or grow impatient when they became distracted. Instead, he turned each moment into an adventure, making the smallest details feel magical. Emma watched from a bench near the bow, her heart pulled in two directions. She saw the man she had once loved so fiercely, the one who had made her believe in futures and promises, but layered over that was the memory of the man who had accused her of betrayal and refused to hear her truth. She wanted to cling to her anger because it was safer, but the evidence before her made it harder every day. He was patient, engaged, and more present than she could have imagined, and the girls adored him. When the sun began to dip low, painting the horizon in soft gold and lavender, Andrew anchored the boat and set out a small picnic on deck. Sandwiches, fruit and lemonade for the girls, wine for Emma. They ate together, laughter mingling with the sound of water lapping against the hull. At one point, Sophie climbed into Andrew's lap, unprompted, resting her head against his chest. Her twin Lily followed a moment later, squeezing herself into the space beside them. Andrew wrapped his arms around both, and Emma noticed the way his expression softened completely, a kind of tenderness she hadn't thought him capable of showing. Later, as they were docking, Emma lingered by the railing, watching the last light fade from the water. Andrew joined her, his voice quiet but certain. "I don't know how to undo what I did," he said, not looking at her. "I can't erase the years I missed, and I'll never stop regretting them. But I can be here now. I can be better now." She studied him for a long moment, searching for the polished charm she had come to expect from him, but it wasn't there. What she saw instead was raw sincerity, almost vulnerable. It was disarming in a way that left her unsettled. She didn't answer right away, but as they stepped off the boat and the girls slipped their small hands into his, Emma realized that her silence wasn't the same as rejection. That night, after she tucked the girls into bed, she sat by the window with a blanket draped over her shoulders. She could hear the faint echo of their giggles from earlier in the day, the memory of their faces pressed against Andrew's side. She told herself she was still protecting them, still protecting herself. But another truth whispered through her thoughts, a truth she didn't want to face yet. The man who had once broken her heart was slowly, persistently stitching something back together, and part of her was terrified that she wanted him to succeed. Winter arrived in the coastal town with crisp mornings and evenings scented with wood smoke, the streets lined with twinkling lights as the holiday season approached. For Emma, the weeks leading up to Christmas had always been bittersweet. The girls loved the magic of it, decorating the small tree in their living room, hanging stockings, pressing their noses to shop windows to admire the displays. But Emma carried the quiet ache of doing it all alone. This year, however, felt different, though she hadn't admitted to herself why. Andrew had woven himself into their lives so seamlessly that it was hard to imagine the days before his return. He was there for the school holiday fair, helping the girls make paper snowflakes at their classroom table. He was there the evening they visited the town square for the annual tree lighting, standing beside Emma as they sipped hot cider. The glow from the giant fir casting their shadows together on the cobblestone. On Christmas Eve, he invited them to his place in the city. Emma hesitated at first, wary of crossing the invisible line she'd kept between their worlds. But the girls begged, their eyes bright with anticipation, and she found herself agreeing. His apartment had changed since she last saw it, less like a showpiece for magazines, more like a home. The sleek furniture was softened with warm throws. Framed photographs lined the mantel, and in the center of the room stood a tree tall enough to brush the ceiling, dripping with ornaments that looked as though they'd been chosen with care rather than expense. Beneath it, wrapped gifts were stacked in neat rows, their tags written in his bold, familiar handwriting. The evening unfolded with an ease Emma hadn't expected. The girls tore into their presents, squealing over dolls and art sets, while Andrew knelt beside them, helping assemble a wooden dollhouse with a patience that made her heart twist. Later, after the girls had fallen asleep on the couch in a tangle of blankets, Emma found herself standing beside him in the kitchen, the low hum of a holiday playlist filling the quiet between them. He poured them both a glass of wine, leaning against the counter as he spoke. "I know I can't change the beginning of our story," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the sleeping twins in the other room. "But I want to change the ending. I want to be their father, Emma. Not just in name, but in every way that matters. And I want a chance to be in your life again, if you'll let me." The words caught her off guard, not because she hadn't imagined him saying something like this, but because of the unpolished sincerity behind them. There was no grand gesture, no rehearsed speech, just a man laying his heart bare. She looked at him for a long moment, the years of hurt and distrust pressing against the quiet warmth that had been building between them. She thought of the girls, of the way they lit up around him, of the steadiness he had shown since his return. And for the first time, she allowed herself to admit what she had been feeling for months. She wanted this. Emma stepped closer, her voice low but certain. "If you're serious about this, Andrew, it's not just about showing up when it's easy. It's about staying every day, no matter what." "I know," he replied, his tone steady. "I'm not walking away again." Something in her chest loosened then, a tension she hadn't realized she was still holding. She nodded, and though no promises were formally exchanged, something shifted between them in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by the glow of Christmas lights. Later, when Andrew carried the sleeping girls to the guest room, Emma followed, watching as he tucked them in with the kind of care only a father could give. She stood in the doorway, the faint smile on her lips mirrored by the warmth in her chest, knowing that while the past could never be rewritten, the future was theirs to shape. And for the first time in years, she believed it could be beautiful.